Welcome to Deer Camp Big Buck Spotlight. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the Milo Hanson buck, the current Boone and Crockett world record typical whitetail. No matter how many times I've looked at pictures of this deer, I'm just as amazed as I was the first time I laid my eyes on it. It's truly amazing that a deer like this was at one time roaming the wilderness. I remember as a kid imagining a buck like this appearing in the woods in front of me while out hunting. Of course, that never happened, but just the fantasy that it could kept me out in the stand a bit longer, even when I wanted to head back to camp. But anyway, before I get too carried away with my own feelings on this deer, let's talk more about the specifics of this buck. The buck was harvested by Milo Hanson on November 23, 1993, near Hanson's residence outside Biggar, Saskatchewan. Much like the story of the Johnny King buck, Milo harvested the giant whitetail with his rifle during a deer drive. He took multiple shots at the deer and even hit the antler with a bullet like Johnny King did on his buck. I find it interesting that their stories sound quite the same. Knowing that so many hunters in the same group were after this deer, I can't help but wonder how the other hunters in the hunting party feel about Milo being the one that harvested the buck. It was no secret that this deer was in the area. It was seen by many people, and the deer was being hunted hard. I just think it would be interesting to hear from the other hunters that were after this deer, to hear their stories, and if they had any close calls with the buck. While Milo's dreams came true on that day, many other dreams were no doubt crushed. This deer has occupied many of my dreams, and I wasn't even hunting it. The thing that I've always found interesting about this buck is the fact that it was aged at only 3.5 years old, which means the buck never even reached its full antler potential. A buck typically realizes its full antler growth potential at 5.5 to 6.5 years old, which means the Hanson buck was at least 2 years away from reaching its full potential, which is really quite fascinating. However, it's highly likely that if the buck had made it another year, it would have grown non-typical points, which more than likely would have prevented it from being the typical world record. Most experts would agree with that. The buck was harvested at the exact right time for it to have such a perfect typical and symmetrical rack, and at the right time in its antler growth to become the new typical world record. The buck scores 213 1/8 inches, beating out the previous world record buck by about 7 inches. It's been over 30 years now since Milo harvested this world record, and I wouldn't be surprised if the record stood for another 30 years. It's hard to imagine a buck beating it. Some have come close, so it's definitely possible. And you know what they say, records are made to be broken. Even when the day comes that the Milo buck is no longer the record, it won't take away how magnificent this deer truly is. As I've said before, I'm just fascinated every time I see this deer, and I know I'm not alone when I say that. If I ever had the opportunity to see this deer in person, I would have to be kicked out of Milo's residence, as I would no doubt overstay my welcome. If I haven't yet conveyed it, I'm a big fan of this whitetail. But that'll do it for this episode of Deer Camp Big Buck Spotlight. Until next time, remember, you're always welcome at Deer Camp.